For nearly 2 years after that meeting with the bishop, not a single family made a serious inquiry toward mine again. Not one. I remember counting, at one point, how many other young women my own age had received proposals or serious courtship interest during that same stretch, and coming up with a number embarrassingly higher than my own, which was 0. If you'd asked most people in my community during that stretch, they probably would have told you I was one of the more sought-after young women in the district, given everything that had happened a couple of years earlier. The truth was almost the opposite. I had quietly become someone families were actively steering their sons away from, and it took me a long time to understand exactly why. By the end of this video, you'll understand the real reason an entire stretch of my early 20s passed with almost no serious courtship at all, despite everything you might assume about attention and appearance, and what it actually took for someone to finally choose me anyway. If you've watched my other videos, you already know about the singing incident, the meeting with the bishop, and the 2 years of coolness that followed after I stayed loyal to a friend who'd left the church. What I haven't told you yet is how those two separate situations combined into something much harder to shake. A quiet reputation that followed me into every new courtship conversation for years afterward, long after either individual incident should reasonably have been forgotten by anyone still paying attention. It started, I think, almost immediately after that meeting with the bishop. Word of what happened at that singing, 2 young men arguing seriously enough to bring in church leadership, spread through several neighboring districts within weeks, and with it came a version of the story that framed me, fairly or not, as the kind of young woman capable of causing that sort of disruption simply by existing. Families talk to each other constantly in a community this size, mothers comparing notes about which young women might suit their sons over quilting circles and after church on Sundays, and I started noticing, slowly at first, that families who might otherwise have approached mine seemed to quietly reconsider once they heard my name mentioned alongside that particular story. A cousin of mine, married into a district 2 hours away, told me once that even there, people had heard some version of what happened, usually exaggerated well beyond what had actually taken place that evening. The loyalty situation with Miriam made things worse in a different way. Families who were already cautious about the singing incident now had a second reason for hesitation. A young woman willing to maintain a friendship the community had collectively decided to distance itself from, someone who might not simply fall in line with whatever the group consensus happened to be, someone who might raise her own children with the same independent conscience rather than teaching them to always follow the safest, quietest path. I remember overhearing, secondhand through a cousin, one mother describing me as lovely to look at, but more trouble than most young men would want to take on, a phrase that stung far more than any direct insult could have, precisely because it wasn't cruel exactly, just quietly, thoroughly discouraging, the kind of comment meant to close a door gently rather than slam it shut. For nearly 2 years, I watched younger friends of mine receive serious inquiries, court, and in some cases marry, while my own situation remained almost entirely static, sitting through wedding after wedding as a guest rather than a bride, smiling and helping in kitchens for celebrations that weren't mine, wondering quietly each time whether my own would ever come. I told myself more than once during that stretch that I simply hadn't met the right person yet, which was true in its own way. But underneath that reasonable explanation sat a harder truth I didn't fully admit to myself until much later, that plenty of families had likely considered me and quietly moved on to safer options instead. Young women without any story attached to their names at all. Girls whose biggest scandal was showing up a few minutes late to church. I remember one particular gathering, a barn raising that drew families from 3 different districts, where I overheard, entirely by accident, 2 mothers discussing potential matches for their sons while I stood restocking a table of food nearby, close enough to hear but apparently not visible to either of them. My name came up briefly, followed almost immediately by a slight pause and a comment about how it might be simpler to look elsewhere, given everything that had apparently happened with me over the past couple of years. I stood frozen behind a stack of lumber for a moment, unsure whether to make my presence known or simply slip away quietly, my face burning despite the cool morning air, eventually choosing to leave without either woman realizing I'd heard any of it. If you're wondering how that 2-year stretch of quiet rejection actually ended, and what kind of man was finally willing to overlook a reputation most families seem determined to avoid, stay with me, because that part of the story surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire series. The man I eventually married, David, wasn't from our immediate district at all, which I think mattered more than I realized at the time, having grown up nearly 3 hours away, far enough that the version of my story circulating in his own community had traveled through enough retellings to become almost unrecognizable by the time it reached him. He'd heard some version of my story secondhand, the way everyone eventually does in communities this interconnected, but he approached my family anyway, and when I asked him directly, early in our courtship, sitting together on my parents' porch one evening, whether the stories bothered him, he said something I've never forgotten. He said a woman willing to stay loyal to a friend even when it cost her socially, and a woman capable of drawing that much attention without ever actually seeking it, sounded less like trouble to him and more like exactly the kind of character he'd want in a wife. I remember sitting across from him, genuinely stunned, having spent 2 years assuming those exact qualities were the reason nobody wanted to court me, finally hearing someone frame them as the reason he did. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he'd rather marry someone with a complicated story people misunderstood than someone with no story at all, simply because she'd never done anything worth talking about. Looking back on that entire stretch now, I understand something I couldn't quite see clearly while I was living through it. My community didn't reject me because I was beautiful. Not exactly. They grew cautious around a story that had attached itself to my name, a story built from real events but exaggerated and reshaped through years of retelling until the actual me, the person underneath all of it, became harder for most families to see clearly at all. It took someone from slightly outside that immediate web of gossip, someone who could hear the story without already having decided what it meant about my character, to actually see me plainly enough to want to marry me. I think about those 2 quiet years often, not with resentment toward the families who steered their sons elsewhere, because I understand now how reasonable caution can look from the outside looking in at a reputation you don't fully control, especially in a community where a young man's mother has genuine influence over who he ends up courting seriously. But I also think there's something worth saying plainly here, that being talked about isn't the same thing as being known, and it took the right person, patient enough to look past a story that had grown far larger than the truth underneath it, to finally see that difference clearly. I sometimes wonder how many other young women in similar situations never find that person, simply because a story outran the truth before anyone patient enough came along to ask what had actually happened. David and I have been married for several years now, and every so often, at some gathering or another, an older woman will mention, almost fondly, how relieved everyone eventually was that I finally settled down, as though those 2 quiet years had simply been an unfortunate delay, rather than the direct result of a story people themselves had helped spread. I usually just smile and let the comment pass without correction, having long since decided that some misunderstandings aren't worth the effort of untangling, especially once you've already found the one person who took the time to untangle it properly himself. Tell me in the comments, has a reputation you didn't fully create ever followed you longer than it should have? I'd genuinely like to hear how you finally moved past it if you did.